Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Saifedean Ammous, author of The Bitcoin Standard. Saifedean, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me again, Max. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a really fantastic book that is gaining a lot of attention all over the crypto community and all over the really economics professionals looking at this, because this is the first major change in monetary history we've had in many hundreds of years, actually. People say, first question, the use case for Bitcoin is what? And one of the things that is very important to understand is that this is money that can be controlled completely outside of government. And that's a huge break in the history of money, and it's vastly important. Can you just speak on that to begin with?
Yeah, so I think a common problem is that a common problem people have with Bitcoin is, as somebody put it to me, is that Bitcoin has been misevangelized. People have marketed Bitcoin as a cheaper, better PayPal or a cheaper, better Visa and MasterCard. And I think that's a complete category error. It's completely missing the point of what Bitcoin is and why Bitcoin is important. Bitcoin is not meant to be a consumer payment network. Bitcoin will have consumer payment networks installed on top of it. Bitcoin is more like a reserve asset, or more like the base money that is used for the settlement of consumer payments. So this, the point of my book was really to try and explain that, and the title, The Bitcoin Standard, tries to get that point across by drawing an analogy with the gold standard. And I think this is really the better way of understanding how Bitcoin functions. It's similar to the gold in a financial system, and then consumer payments are layered on top of that.
But let's continue on this idea that it's gold outside of governments, because governments and the central banking system and the fiat money system, and even with gold, under the control mostly of governments and gold, the bullion banks, people do not have really the freedom that they would hope to have in a free society, because their money is essentially controlled, and therefore they are controlled. By putting money outside of the banking system and giving people access to this unimpeachable, immutable, sound money or hard money, you change the dynamic between people and government. That's extraordinary and only possible with Bitcoin. You talk about it at length in the book. Expand on it a little.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a very important book to read about this, which preceded Bitcoin, is The Sovereign Individual by Davidson and Rees-Mogg. It was written in 1997, but they discuss the creation of something very similar to Bitcoin as the final missing jigsaw puzzle piece that will complete this shift away from having more and more government power and control over monetary assets and over individuals, towards moving more towards a society in which individuals themselves have the sovereignty. And specifically, the idea is that digital telecommunications and all of this modern technology that we have is moving individuals towards having more sovereignty and more control, because more and more of the economic activity of the world is now informational. It's not physical. It doesn't require physical capital. It's data, it's information, it's knowledge. And information and knowledge is very hard to control with guns. It's very hard to coerce. It's very hard to put in the service of people with guns.
You mentioned men with guns there. Paul Krugman of the New York Times recently wrote an editorial criticizing Bitcoin, as he's done several times. He said, the thing about dollars and fiat money and the history of money is that it has progressively taken friction out of money and the use of money. And ultimately, however, the US dollar, we have to remember, it's backed by men with guns.
Yes.
Now, aren't men with guns friction?
Yes, exactly. It's a remarkably stupid thing to say. I think it's, you know, the improvements in payment settlement are not things that governments introduced. The improvements in payments technology came because of the telegraph and because of the telephone and because of all methods of communication and transportation. Governments' imposition of monopolies on these infrastructures have not reduced the friction on this. Like any kind of government monopoly does not help the consumers, because all that it does is it restricts their choices of the consumers and of the providers. So by turning this into a monopoly, it does not help the advancement of these things. And on the contrary, it does the exact opposite. And the idea that, you know, having men with guns threatening people and throwing them into jail is somehow something to boast about how your currency is better, I think is quite astonishing. The fact that any business or any individual would go around saying, well, my business is better because if you don't use mine, then we would shoot you or throw you into jail, I think tells you everything you need to know about the kind of business that they're running. It's not something that would be chosen freely on the market. Otherwise, it wouldn't need men with guns behind it. So, the history of the evolution of money and the evolution of payments and the evolution of payment networks and banking is the history of human innovation and ingenuity on the one hand, and then human violence, men with guns trying to co-opt that to the benefit of individuals or governments or groups that benefit from that. But we see this in any kind of a market economic system. When there's free market, when there's competition, when people are free to have a choice between different options, the best option wins. When governments...
All right, people have a choice, a free choice. Yeah. That gets into some historical economic considerations. And actually, the Bitcoin standard is, in my mind, really 3 books. There's the Bitcoin book. There's a brilliant encapsulation in history of Austrian economics, which for folks who are interested in Austrian economics, they can get a lot by reading this book. And thirdly, it's a bit of a self-help book. In chapter 5, talking about high time and low time preference, it's a very interesting look at how economies work. But that idea of choice that you keep bringing up, and people, I think, would like to choose to get out of a system that we're in now, where banks like Wells Fargo are serial criminals. All the major banks in the UK and the US are engaged in serial criminality. And this concept of too big to fail, and their co-option of the system, and their ability to simply print money whenever they make a mistake. They just print more money to cover up that mistake. People, if they had the option to choose a different system, I think would choose a different system. And so Bitcoin is that path, right? I mean, you can choose to opt out of the serial criminality of Wall Street and Wall Street banks by moving from fiat money to hard money, Bitcoin, right?
Absolutely. This is the incredible thing about Bitcoin and why it's a truly astonishing innovation, because the men with guns can't really stop it. It's not exactly something that can be stopped because it's not physical. There are no locations to it, and there are no... in my book, I have a section of the book that discusses how to kill Bitcoin, and I illustrate how it's just not easy. It's not an easy thing to do. So effectively, anybody in the world with an internet connection, and that means a growing percentage of the planet right now, is able to have access to a hard form of money that can't be inflated. And that's really the key concept. We're putting the men with guns on the side because people now have the choice to opt out. They have the choice to go around the men with guns, and the guns can't stop data going through wires, so or through satellites or whatever. So we're going to see this. So we're seeing a free market competition now, and the guns won't help government's money, as people just simply can exit almost untraceably and without any ability to detect them. Somebody could have a part of their life savings put in Bitcoin, and if more and more people keep doing this, it becomes more and more profitable for others to hold Bitcoin, and the network continues to grow and provides a serious alternative to central banking, which is what really is the subtitle of my book. And that's really how I think of the importance of a Bitcoin. It's an alternative to a system of government monopolies on central banks around the world, where you just get to choose to take part in a system that performs the functions of central banks in terms of payment settlement internationally and monetary policy internationally without having to resort to the central bank. It's an astonishing idea if you think about it. For people like Krugman, central banking was the crowning achievement of financial innovation, that finally, after all these centuries, we've managed to find this model of a central bank that has a monopoly that can force people to use its own currency and protect the banking system. Which
Let's talk about Krugman for a second, because of course he represents a school of Keynesianism.
Yes.
And this Bitcoin is a school, really Austrian school, hard money school. Keynesians kind of define the economy as level of spending, and they're willing to go into debt to spend. They have no recognition of hard money whatsoever. Mm-hmm. I say on this show a lot of times, you can't have capitalism without capital. You can't have capital without a savings rate that encourages people to save, because that's where you get the money to build your economy.
Yeah.
That's kind of an Austrian concept in a way.
Yeah.
So here you have finally a way, the Keynesians out there, the Krugmans out there, they have the federal government and the central banks on their side. Clearly they're corrupt. Clearly they are pushing war. Clearly they're pushing indebtedness. They're the ones behind student debt. They're the ones behind medical debt because they don't think that's a problem. They think it never, as Keynes said, in the long run, we all die, or something to that effect, that there's never a reconciliation. But hard money, of course, was dominated by gold thinking, and that's where we first met, was talking about gold, I think eight years ago or so. But Bitcoin allows for that, not only hard money and for saving, but to do it completely outside of the government system. In a way, you're bleeding the government of its ability to coerce and introduce schemes that are underwriting the health system and the education system in ways that are not healthy. Let's talk about Chapter 5 for a second, which I heard you speak recently. You said it's your favorite chapter. It's about time preference, high time preference, low time preference. So it kind of plays into this a little bit. Talk about this if you can.
Yeah, it's a very important concept. I think possibly the most important concept in economics. I make sure to teach it in every class that I teach. Whatever the topic of the class, I have to get this through to my students because I believe it's the most important concept you could learn in economics. And of course, in the modern economic university textbook, it's not even mentioned. The concept just relates to how much people discount the future compared to the present. So people with a high time preference have a high discount rate on the future. They don't think of the future much. They prefer to focus on the present. People with a low time preference think more of the future than people with a high time preference. And this, I think, is an enormously important concept because on an individual level, your own success in life, your own whatever you want to achieve, sure, outside factors will affect you, but more important than outside factors, more important than everything else in the world, is your own time preference, your own ability to prioritize the future over the present. So a person with a high time preference who keeps ignoring the present and focusing on keeps ignoring the future and focusing on the present will suffer the consequences of that in the long run. You can think of the example of, say, professional athletes who make a lot of money, and then, once they retire, they're broke because no matter how much money they make, they're always spending more and more of it. On the other hand, for low time preference, think of the people who are born in poverty, don't have any blessing of, say, athlete or artistic ability, and yet they work hard all their life and they save and they accumulate capital and their livelihood improves over time. I think, this force of just how you orient yourself towards the future or towards the present is one of the most important economic
Right, this is
factors.
when I jump in and say it's a bit of a self-help book, if you will, because on page 77 of the Bitcoin Standard, you write, while microeconomics is focused on transactions between individuals and macroeconomics on the role of government in the economy, the reality is that most important economic decisions to any individual's well-being are the ones they conduct in their trade-offs with their future self.
Exactly.
Every day, an individual will conduct a few of these transactions.
Many.
All has an impact effectively on their future self. You are an economic machine in this way.
Absolutely.
If you have a government and a system that's encouraging you to go into debt perpetually, you are going to find yourself invariably watching junk TV, eating junk food, watching junk art, obese, unhappy, and
I wouldn't say I wouldn't say inevitably, but I would say it definitely biases your decision
All right, we have
making
to
towards
cut it
that.
there. We'll come back. We'll do some more. We got to say goodbye for now. And that's going to do it for this edition. You can stay for a second?
Sure.
Okay. That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Saifedean Ammous. If you want to, with the Bitcoin Standard, the immediate classic. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.